Welcome to the Lender Lounge. I'm Jeremy.Baxter.
And I'm Mistymatisons. Welcome to Strikepoint Strategies.
Yes, welcome. And we've got some cool stuff coming up that we want to talk about. Ultimately, we're going to talk about the transaction details. Now that your offer's been accepted, what does it look like during that part? But let's talk about our week. How was your week?
Well, it was interesting. We definitely got in touch with some new buyers. Jeremy and I hosted an open house on Saturday, and I want to bring this up because as a broker, you never know where opportunity may strike. And we were out of the county. We stopped to get coffee, and when we came back out to my car, somebody had backed into it. And it was a very minor collision, no big deal. But just out of talking, the couple, they were going to look at properties. They hadn't established a broker or a lender, and the accident turned into an opportunity to pick up a buyer.
Yeah, and you were like, your reaction to what it was like, oh, okay, let's just get some information. We'll get it handled, because we were in open house mode. Like, yeah, we got to get this open house. And then he was so nice, and he waited around and just said, hey, I backed into your car.
He was very honest.
Yeah, super cool. And then you gave him his card, or you gave him your card, and he was like, oh, you're an agent.
Yep.
And then he was like, well, we're going to look at property right now. And it just turned into this really cool situation. And
we actually laughed about the fact that I guess he bumped into me for us to do business together. You know, I told him things happen. We've all done it. So, you never know where you're going to find a buyer. More importantly, I'm glad that I kept calm, cool, and collected in order to...
Being nice goes a long way.
Yeah, it certainly does. So, like we just discussed, you never know where a buyer may come up. We have a lot more buyers coming out of the woodwork. A lot of people are starting to gear up for the season in the spring and the summer to start looking. So let's talk about, your offer's been accepted. You know, what's kind of the first step that you need to establish? And that would be providing your earnest money. So what is the importance of the earnest money, and what does it actually mean to the seller? Yeah,
so that's a good point, because it always does come up in our consultations, and sometimes I'll leave it up to the realtor to discuss that. We do touch on it, and a lot of people are confused. I have a buyer I'm working with right now, and just yesterday she was asking, she's like, okay, so someone told me I have to put earnest money down, and like if I don't buy the house, they keep it. And I was like, no, it's not, no. So there's a lot of misinformation surrounded the earnest money deposit and what that looks like. So let's go into that. So from you, from the broker perspective, tell us about earnest money, Misty.
Well, when I start working with a buyer, we're not going to talk about earnest money when we finally find the house. We want to talk about it in the beginning so they understand what it is. They understand how they get it back or whether they don't, and what those circumstances may be. It's typical for a minimum of 1% based upon the purchase price, and I would say that's minimum. If it's a $500,000 house, more than likely you're going to see a $5,000 earnest money. It is establishing the seriousness to the seller and the listing broker of your offer. Now, one thing that I have seen recently is $1,000 earnest money on a home that's almost $400,000. What you end up finding out is that there's probably not any other funds besides that $1,000 to get through home inspection, repairs, or credits. Do they have the money for closing costs? Do they have money for appraisal gaps? So as a buyer broker, I'm always going to guide my clients in what's an ample earnest money that shows the seriousness to the seller. And then as a listing broker, you also want to make sure that you're accepting something that's ample.
Absolutely, I agree. And also the earnest money can come from your down payment. So if you've got your down payment funds, a lot of people think it's outside of that. So what I tell them is like, well, let's use a portion of your down payment, $3,000 to $5,000, again, depending on, the offer and the price of the house, those
And
types
all
of
of that,
situations.
at closing, that gets applied to the purchase price of the house and everything. Ways of, getting your earnest money back is if you have contingencies such as, let's say, an inspection contingency. You go through the inspection, you find that there's too many repairs, or maybe you and the seller can't agree on exactly what those repairs are, or a credit, and you decide to terminate the contract because you're within that contingency. That's when you should be allowed to receive your earnest money back.
And that's your due diligence period, right? Could be anywhere from 10 to 15 days or whatever the contract specifies. So typically you go under contract, and then there's something in the contract that states, hey, earnest money deposit needs to be at title within 3 business days. Whatever's
And you
negotiated.
can always negotiate that. Sometimes I'll do 4 or 5. It depends on what somebody's circumstances or their timeline is.
Yeah, and it's really good because what you're doing is communicating to the seller, like, hey, take this house off the market while I'm really serious, but remove it from the market so that I can go and do my inspections during that due diligence period, and then find out if this really is what I want. You're looking through the inspection. So you do have plenty of time. If you find something, you're like, this is not the property for me, you can back out, take your earnest money walk, and go on to the next thing. And I do want to talk about like your walkaway number. I know we discussed that with our buyers too in a competitive market. One thing that we talk about is having a walkaway number. So if you're out there searching for a home and you're in competitive bids, you got to have a walkaway number. What that means is like, okay, if it goes to, $550, that's our bottom line. That's the highest we can go. And if it goes beyond that, you walk away, just emotion out of it, but that's an agreement that you as a buyer, and then, if you're buying the house with somebody else, you guys got to be, in agreement on that.
Well, and if your walkaway number is 550, you shouldn't be looking at a house that's 550.
Right.
Maybe 530, 520, 525. It all depends on the area, the property, what is the interest, what's going on, do they have offers in and such. But in a super competitive market in most of greater Seattle, and a lot of brokers are coming forward and talking about lots of multiple offers. We're seeing, above ask. There's evidence of funds back in the game to be able to bridge any potential appraisal gaps. So depending on where you are, it's getting quite competitive in our area right now. And it's early in the year.
Yeah, we're seeing waived inspections right now too. So I have a buyer that's out looking right now, and she was out there talking about, they're up against a couple other offers. The listing agent told us what they had, and waived inspections. We're back at it again. So, but yeah, brief overview of what earnest money looks like, and that was one of the questions that we had that came in. What does earnest money do? What is it? Why is it? What else?
Well, at that point, your offer has been crafted, and you should know with your buyer broker all of the contingencies that you're going to look into. So are you going to have a home inspection completed? Your buyer broker should be able to give you numerous home inspectors that are on a preferred list that they can suggest. You're also more than able to contact your own and such. There will also be potential septic inspections or a sewer scope. Mm-hmm. This gives you the opportunity to start looking at the bones of the house to determine, is the purchase price in value with the house and the condition. You need to be able to kind of unveil the curtain and understand what's going on behind closed doors.
Yeah. Do we have a match on price and value?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Inspections, especially for first-time home buyers, are always overwhelming. If you have not owned a home, then you may not understand the long list of daily, weekly, monthly, yearly maintenance that needs to be done on a home. So, for instance, if we're looking at a home that's, 40, 50 years old, and this day and age, that's pretty common, especially in this area. You may have a 60, 70, 80-page home inspection list. To be honest, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always alarming. It depends on what's on that list. home inspectors are going to be really precise. I've had items as in a nail on a painted deck needed to be pounded in flush, even though it was elevated so very little that the paint rim had not broke yet. So if you give me 80 pages of something that's that minor, that can look overwhelming. You really need to break it down on what are the major key things. And what brokers always want to talk about first is the foundation, the septic sewer, the roof, and I think that's it. Sorry. The roof, the foundation, the septic, or the sewer. Those are kind of the three major things. Then you're going to move on to something like plumbing and electrical. If anything's not up to code, those line items can run, quite a few punchlines within that home inspection, but it doesn't necessarily mean you should shy away from it. These are things between you, your inspector, your broker, you should be able to navigate and determine whether you want to take that on or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had buyers that were freaked out over a couple of the inspections.
That were pretty normal based upon the year of the home and the condition.
Yeah, and that's another reason why if you're approved at whatever 550 and that's your top of your approval, you may not want to look at houses that are at 550. Give yourself a little bit of a buffer to have some funds and negotiate you getting some of that stuff repaired if you do. So let's say you go through your due diligence, inspection comes back and you're good to roll forward. What are we looking at next?
Well, we're also, we represented a buyer a couple years ago, and this came up, and it's becoming very, very, very common. There's a lot of electrical panels that have been recalled that they're outdated. They're not pushing out the amount of electricity needed. It's working fine, but is it up to code? No. So these are always things to stay within your budget, because if a seller's not going to give you a credit or, taking an item that's $3,000-$5,000 minimum to replace a new electrical panel, that's something you may want to do after the transaction's closed. So you always need to keep in mind to keep some money around, because after you close, everyone that has bought a home will know that there's a lot of money goes out the window the first 6 months of just trying to make it your own and kind of bring in everything that you've learned from the home inspection.
Absolutely. Again, having money off to the side, having some reserves to be able to, you want to buy curtains and blinds and
what I don't want to see representing a buyer is you not have the means to compromise in this negotiation and put it all on the seller, because if that is the case, you're probably not going to get what you want.
Yeah, you're tapped out.
It's a compromise, and it's a give and take. And if you're going to ask for something, eventually they're going to say no. Mm-hmm. They want to meet in the middle, or they want to be able to understand what is it that you need from them. But I'm seeing a lot of buyers that aren't willing to give up anything, but keep asking for more and more and more and more.
Yeah, there's got to be a compromise, and that's part of the negotiations. It's super important in that regard.
So let's talk about, outside of the home inspection, what are some other twists and turns that we've experienced that most people need to understand will come up under a transaction? I mean, recently, as I was representing the seller, the buyer lost their job about a week before closing, and that affects everything. The wheels just completely came off on everything that we all worked so hard for to close. What are some other examples? Why don't you talk about how people may recklessly spend money right before closing?
So let's talk about things that can go wrong. And us both, we do talk with our clients about not purchasing things on credit cards. So when you're in the process of buying a home, things that you don't want to do is go get new credit. I've had a couple of incidences where one of the buyers was super excited to go and surprise the family, before closing. Went and got a new Macy's store and racked up a bunch of credit card debt, buying furniture for the home and beds, and again wanted to surprise. And just because the approval was in, the contract was accepted, and we were about 10 days from closing, somewhere right around there. And
they think that it's not going to affect
because they're already
their credit, and after underwriting before closing, you're looking at their financials at the very bitter end to make sure that everything can be signed off on.
Yeah, we're pulling a refresh.
Yeah, if your credit score or your debt to income ratio now becomes out of whack, it's not just telling you should not open any new credit. We're going to tell you the reasons why. What will happen if you do that? And
right.
It could be very minimal. It could be a washing machine.
Yeah,
at $700-800.
You don't want to do anything. And I've had buyers say, "Hey, man, Home Depot's having this really killer sale right now. I can pick up tile." I was like, "Bro, don't.
Yep.
Just hold on. Or ask them if, hey, we're closing in 2 days, and this thing ends in 2 days, so can we wait another day?" Or but don't do that. And you hear often people, all over social media, they joke about, "Yeah, don't go buy a car." That does happen. I've had it happen, and
even though they're told and they're educated, I just don't think that they understand the severity of that decision.
No, because this is an incident we had where husband and wife buying this home, everything is going good, and the husband went and bought a car over the weekend. Killer deal. I mean, you got to couldn't say no, but when you're adding a significant car payment to things, when you're kind of already at that debt to income threshold, it killed the entire deal, and even, it was like, well, what can we do? We weren't able to save that one. And that one it was not good. But the other ones we were able to, even though we had credit cards that were racked up, at the end we were able to fix that, and they still were able to buy the house under different terms, but we got it to the finish line. But
those are circumstances that if the buyer has failed financing due to a reckless decision, these are circumstances that you may not get your earnest money back. Mm-hmm. These are twists and turns that you have to stay within the confines of your contract in order to be awarded your earnest money back. If you're without of those lines, then more than likely you're not going to get it back.
Right. And the other thing too, it goes back to the importance of being pre-approved and underwritten. So when you do start looking for homes, you already know your numbers. Again, your strike point. What price you're looking at, what that payment's going to be. Roughly.
You know what your threshold is, your range, your low range, your high range, and it gives us a good idea of where to go.
And you fully understand your purchase strategy. So in that,
as a listing broker, an offer that comes in pre-approved basically is showing me that a lender has looked at their financials and they've determined that they can purchase at this amount. Fully underwritten is a whole nother process that puts so many more layers of security on the offer.
Right. And it's a strong offer. At that point you can do, so in a competitive market, one thing we were doing was waiving the financing contingency up front. And that is a very specific conversation with the buyers, with us, because if this is a 10 out of 10, basically waiving that contingency, your financing's in the back, but you got to buy this thing. You're buying it, and that's a strong offer. So it communicates to the seller, hey, our financing is completed. We removed all the risk from anything happening to this loan during the escrow period, 30 days or whatever is negotiated. So it's an effective way to communicate that we are solid, we're ready, and we want to move forward with this.
Why don't you talk about the details of somebody that's pre-approved versus somebody that's fully underwritten?
Okay. So, or a pre-qualification.
Yes.
So someone says, hey, I want a pre-qual. It's like, okay, cool. What do you make? You take some numbers down. And there's lenders that will issue a pre-qualification based on the information you've told me, and we haven't looked at anything yet. And so a lot of times you'll see people out shopping with that pre-qualification. They find a house that they love. They go under contract. Emotions are high. They're super excited. Well, now we're asking for W-2s and pay stubs and bank statements and figured out money in that time frame, that 30-day, 45-day escrow, whatever you have. And let's say 10, 15 days into it, we're doing income calculations and the underwriter says, hey, you don't qualify for this home.
Why would Jeremy write a contract if we don't really know your buying power?
Yeah, we would.
That's something to understand.
I wouldn't.
Are you in good hands? I don't know if you can afford this house. You know why? He doesn't know, which means you don't know. So getting to the next step is running your credit, looking at your debt to income ratio, how much money you bring in, and determining what is your pre-approval.
Right. And then you're way more comfortable in
now
the
you
entire
know
thing.
what you can spend. And then take them the next step into fully underwritten prior to looking.
So that's where you do a consultation. Hey, I want to buy a house. All right, cool. We're meeting. I want to understand, why do you want to buy a home? There's a whole process in that. But we're going to collect the W-2, the pay stubs, calculate your income. We're going to talk about the price. Here's your max approval. What do you want to afford? And then talk about different strategies on how to win your offer. So it's front loading all that information, and it's giving us a good look at what you can afford. And then also okay, cool, because we're looking at all your financials. There's also an aspect where I'm like, okay, maybe I can introduce them to a financial advisor. I will ask that too. So there's various routes that you can go, but it gives us a magnified look into what you actually can afford and what your purchase power is. And then we have a discussion on your strategy, how we're going to offer that. So
why would you go spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a purchase if you don't really understand whether you can buy it or not? And that's why we're starting this series. It is okay to look online and see what's out there for real estate so you have an idea of how much something is to be able to see the consistency of whether the value is there. But if you're out looking at houses, that are listed with a broker and you haven't determined that buying power, you're kind of wasting your time. Get all of your ducks in a row, dot your I's, cross your T's, and be laser focused, prepared, so that when you're going out, it's not a long, windy road. It's more of a straight connection to exactly where you want to go.
Absolutely. So once you're underwritten, when you put that offer in, again, so this is part of the transaction, literally all we're waiting for is the appraisal title report, so then we get, that contract goes back to the underwriter, and we may get a couple of conditions back that says, hey, we need the appraisal, needs to come in clear, and then title report, and maybe something else, but we want to minimize what those the underwriter conditions are. And once you satisfy those, then we get clear to close. So let's talk through the inspection period's done. We have a fully underwritten buyer because that's how we like to roll. So after due diligence, what happens next? We're waiting for the appraisal, inspection comes back. Let's talk about once that's done. So I guess in the middle of the transaction, sometimes for us, it's like a waiting game. We're done.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes during the inspection, if there's repairs, these are things that you're going to, start to do, whether the seller conducts them or whether a licensed contractors come in. You could agree that everything's fine, you're waiving the inspection, you're ready to move on. You could also negotiate and ask for a credit. So whether you're asking for a certain amount of money and they come back and they compromise somewhere in the middle. After that, everybody needs to, understand that now everything weighs on the appraisal. And it is highly important as a listing broker to list a home that you believe is within an appraisal value. If you're listing it too high, you know that you're going to end up with an appraisal gap. So it's even more important representing the buyer to determine, are we going to be facing an appraisal gap or not? These are things that we would talk about prior to. Depending on the type of loan that you have, you may have appraisal repairs that are required through VA, FHA loans. Things are a lot more lenient with conventional. Typically in the appraisal process, it's bringing everything up to code that is required. If I know that they exist or the listing broker knows they exist, then we should probably maybe start talking about them prior to the appraisal coming up, because the sooner you get ahead of something, there's been times that the seller has said, no, I'm not doing it. We've negotiated enough with the home inspection. The appraisal repairs are up to you. And then you need to modify the contract to allow the buyer to hire a contractor to come in and address those items. So there's a lot of different twists and turns that will come up. If you've done a septic inspection, the listing broker will need to have the septic pumped. There needs to be an on-site septic inspection with the county. And in most counties in the state, it's required. If it's not, as a buyer broker, I would always suggest it to be done.
100%.
A lot of vendors that pump septics will tell you to have the septic pumped about 5 to 7 years. And you will find in some houses that it may never be done.
Yeah.
And what it's doing is it's really taxing on the equipment, and it's like an oil change. It's something that you should be looking at every 5 to 7 years, unless something comes up. So there's all sorts of different inspections, and they may unveil repairs that you need to address. And during the time of the home inspection, septic, sewer scope, appraisal, that time in between typically has some labor involved sometimes.
Mm-hmm. So on appraisal gaps, let's talk about that. What do you do when the appraisal comes in under contract price? So you put your bid in. We got mutual acceptance at $500,000, and it comes in at I don't know, $490. We got a $10,000 gap.
Well, you've agreed to the purchase price. So if your price was $500, you're going to pay for that. So
what options do the buyers have at
typically
that point?
These are the options. There could be a compromise. The seller could absorb the $10,000. The buyer could absorb the $10,000. If the buyer does, the buyer has to show evidence of funds that they have liquid cash to bridge that gap of $10,000. The seller could come down $5,000 and you only pay. This is where your brokers get involved and try to find out the best way. If you cannot agree on that $10,000 gap some way, somehow, the transaction's probably going to be over with. So being able to prep a buyer, a seller to understand, if we face this, what could potentially happen. So if you're coming in with a very low earnest money because you don't have a lot of cash on hand, the seller's willing to give, $5,000 off the purchase price, but they're requesting you to pay the difference and you don't have that. This is where it's the end. And we've spent, probably 3 to 4 weeks close in the transaction. And that's not all of the time putting in your offer, getting it accepted, looking. So these are all things that we want to avoid long before the time comes, and have you understand what twists and turns could happen during the transaction.
And that's a good point. So when a buyer sends us a house, hey, I'm really interested in this house, you pull comps, and we have a potential of an appraisal gap here. So then we're addressing it up front.
Should we put an offer on this house?
Right. Do we have the cash?
If you don't have, an extra 10, 20 grand, maybe should we be looking at a house that would come in at value, or trying to determine. You don't want to enter a transaction and just see how it works out.
Well, the other thing too is that depending on, what loan product you have and how much you're putting down, you can bridge that gap with the single premium mortgage insurance. We can, so there are some strategies to bridge that gap without, borrowing from a family member or a 401k. So depending on, if you're putting 10% or more down, a lot of times you can pay for a single premium mortgage insurance, bumps you up to a higher LTV. So now we're bridging that gap with the down payment. So that's an appraisal gap strategy that, we've implemented multiple times, and it is a conversation that we have. So when we're working together, we look at, okay, hey, Kelly wants to buy this house. So you're pulling comps, making sure, okay, we're right on. Here's how we're going to offer. And again, if it comes up like, hey, we do have the potential of an appraisal gap here, let's address it now. So we already start talking about that. Do we want to put that offer in, or do we have, a strategy in place to mitigate that should that happen?
What's funny is a lot of buyers believe that when your offer is accepted, let's say at $500,000, that's how much you're buying the house for. And that's not necessarily true, because if you've gone through any inspections, there could be credits, there could be money being paid, there could be work that needs to be done, like we just talked about the appraisal. So sometimes at the end of the day, at the end of that transaction, you're not really purchasing the house for exactly what you offered. That can kind of sway in either way. So you always want to be prepared. Don't be at the top of your budget, and make sure that you have enough room of flexibility so that you're not backing out because you've cornered yourself and you have to start all over.
Good info. Yeah. I love it. Okay, so we're halfway through the transaction. Now let's talk about closing. Like, appraisal comes in, fine, right? We got value. Now we're moving forward, and what does that look like? So, tell us.
Well, it always becomes a lot more meticulous for the lender and the broker as we get closer to the end of the transaction. This is where a lot of the action happens behind the scenes. Here's one thing I'll always tell you as a buyer. The last week before closing, if you're really going to close on your closing date, you're going to sign more stuff in that last week. There's just so many things that are going to go back and forth. There's going to be documents that need that the escrow closer needs in order to close. There's always little fine-tune items at the very end. It really is the most stressful part. You may have gotten over all of the obstacles, but getting to that finish line and everybody being on time and making sure that I've done all of my due diligence, you, escrow, everybody involved, that the appraisal gets to the lender, all of that, it's a race at the end to make sure everything is completed in a timely manner, that all of us involved have agreed that this date and this time, my job is done.
Yeah, and that's where the closing plan comes into play. So, cool. We got a close of escrow on a specific date. We're 8 days out from that. And so now we're finalizing documentation, getting docs to title. A lot of information and a lot of emails are going back and forth between everybody at this point. And this
Lots of phone calls.
Yeah, and this is a place where a lot of times a borrower can be overwhelmed just with the amount of communication that's happening at that point. And so the closing plan, that's where I call you. We're like, okay, we're good, right? Let's talk to the seller, selling agent. Hey, we're good. CD signed on this date, and we're closing either on or before. Mm-hmm. And then,
it's my job to connect with everybody involved, with the lender, with title and escrow, that everyone is on the same page, that, we have 3 days to finish this. And it really, this is where it matters. With the lender that you've chosen, it matters what escrow team you have chose. Sometimes the seller will choose that. And 9 times out of 10, there's so many fantastic title and escrow companies in the greater Seattle area. You're gonna end up working with a lot of the same people as brokers, so you really know who you can trust. And if you haven't worked with them, you'll gauge on their communication and whether they're going to be able to help you or not. But everyone in this industry has the same goal: to finish impeccably at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely do. And so the other thing too is we always go through, I always explain the CD. So you're going to get, before closing, it's called your closing disclosure. And now this is the finalized numbers. It's balanced with title, so it matches up with the paperwork. You're going to sign a title, and we go over this in depth. So I'm going to call you like, hey, this is on the way. Once you get it, let's get on the phone and let's talk through this. There's 4 pages that you need to acknowledge. Does this all look good? Yep. In the bag, we're golden. So you sign the CD, and then now there's a 3-day waiting period called TRID.
So at some point, the lender's going to send the numbers to escrow. This is where everything's fine-tuned down to the penny. And at some point, the listing broker and the buyer broker, we're going to now look at the estimated settlement statement. We need to make sure that all of the numbers on the seller's side and the buyer's side coincide with everything that we've been looking at over the transaction. Taxes, property taxes, the down payment, who is absorbing, maybe this credit or that credit, and making sure that everything is balancing out. Once we give the go-ahead that everything looks good, then escrow is going to finalize everything with the lender, and this is where we're going to be down to like the last 24, 48 hours to close.
And that's where we have those awesome words, clear to close.
I always suggest to you that once you sign that CD and you have those few days, let's schedule a final walkthrough. It's really important. You need to make sure, maybe it's been a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks since you've been in the house. Did they move out? Are they leaving it in the condition that you saw, or is there now a big hole in a wall? These are things that we want to go make sure that are all completed. I've heard horror stories from so many brokers that closing is always the date of at 9 p.m. and you're supposed to get your keys at 9:01. And I've heard of people showing up that evening or the next day and the sellers haven't left. So you have to make sure that the entire process is managed to the bitter end.
Yeah, I've been in situations like that too. So, all right, so CD, closing, clear close, TRID, it's a 3-day waiting period from the time you sign your closing disclosure to the time you can sign at title. And then
escrow is going to contact you. They're going to set up your wire to make sure everything's done. They're going to communicate with the seller and the listing broker to make sure that that money that is owed to the seller is wired over. So, and then at some point they will close the transaction and submit all the paperwork to the county on that day, and that's where we get the notification. We are closed and recorded.
Yep. Let's talk about fraud, the wire fraud. That's a big thing. It's a big issue. So as a buyer, once you're coming up to the close date and you're the last leg of the race, so a lot of times you'll get an email and they look legit, like from directly from the people you've been communicating with, the title company, and now with AI, it's even harder to catch, because before you could catch maybe the way the sentences were structured, and you can catch some words where you're like, okay, this seems a little bit off. But it's really important to talk with your agent, talk with your lender right before closing. If you're going to be doing a wire, make sure that the communications are coming directly from title. If you think something is off, call title, call your agent, or call your lender just to verify, because once that goes, if you wire that money to the wrong place, it's gone.
And
so
let me tell you the details of how we try to prevent this. In order for me to do business with a seller or a buyer, I have to submit a wire fraud disclosure and make you aware of wire fraud's a big deal in real estate. The other thing is almost every single title and escrow company that I work with will have kind of their own portal, which is completely secured for you to email. So it's not going from your Gmail account, like you're emailing directly within their system. That's where documents can go back and forth, where you can sign. The one thing that escrow will do is anytime, like in the very beginning, starting with your earnest money, they will tell you exactly how to wire, give you the instructions, and what to tell your bank and where it's going. If you haven't received those instructions very detailed, then call them and let them know where should I be sending this earnest money. But they're fantastic at making sure that your money is protected.
Right. Yeah, they give you a printout. Most of the time, they'll give you that little printout. You take it to your bank. They know exactly what to do.
I've even received in the last year a lot of people looking for real estate. Here's an example. they will find me some way, somehow. I get an email from them. It's someone that I don't know. They're interested in real estate. And I always want to ask them, how did you find me? Because usually if it's a referral or if it's somebody I know, then I understand that. But if you're a stranger, I want to understand, how did you come across me? And they'll just say, I found you on the internet. And that is always a little suspicious, because this day and age, there's so many ways to get to know a broker, or I know somebody, or this one knows somebody. But here was something this has happened to me several times. It was an all-cash buyer from California. They wanted to move into Tacoma, and they wanted to look at $2 million homes. Now, $2 million homes exist in Tacoma, but it's a very specific home. It's in a specific area. It's usually on the water, overlooking the water. It's like the north end of Tacoma. It may be on the water, University Place. But
Bald
when they're
eagles,
right,
and
but when they're
mountain.
telling me that they don't know the area of Tacoma, that tells me they don't realize that a majority of the homes in the city of Tacoma are not $2 million homes. There's very specific neighborhoods, and if you know that, then you would know it. So there are so many people out there that are trying to be very fraudulent in real estate, even acting as buyers. They will find your house listed for sale. They will snag the pictures, put it on Craigslist, and try to rent it out.
Yeah.
So you're maybe sending them money when in fact they have no control over the house.
And land fraud too.
Yes.
Land fraud.
Yep.
So there was a situation here where someone purchased land from somebody else, started to build a home on it. Well, the landowner didn't live in the state, heard about it. Someone had tipped him off. And so he comes in, well, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm building my home here. Big mess. So those are things to look for. And those are the
things
that we
importance
protect
of hiring a broker. And you would never know about any of these things that we hear about, unfortunately, on a regular basis, to make sure that we have our feelers out and our ears open, our eyes open to prevent anything like this from happening. Mm-hmm. There is just about everyone in real estate can tell you at least one story of somebody that was trying to get over on somebody.
Yeah, happens all the time.
It does.
We gotta watch for it, definitely.
I wanted to share a story about my husband and I looking for our house, which was, it'll be 9 years ago this year. So we knew what our budget was. We knew where we wanted our payment. We started looking at houses in the area, in a broad area, to understand what we could get. And I found the house that we live in, and it was honestly everything that we talked about. It gave us acreage and privacy. We loved the floor plan. We loved that the master was on the main floor, blah, blah, blah. And I immediately felt very overwhelmed about how much we were going to pay, even though it was just a few $100s more than what our rent and like storage unit was. So really we weren't paying that much more, but it's overwhelming. And I immediately went back to online and I looked, and there was a home that was it was much smaller. It was on a much smaller lot, and I just felt like, oh, we can afford that. That just is so much. That's so much easier, and I won't worry. And it was cute and it was darling, but my husband said, we won't stay in that home. We will be moving out of it in 3 to 5 years. He goes, we own more stuff than what we could put into it. I feel like we've already outgrown it. I feel like we're not really spending more than we are right now. It's a purchase, so it feels different than rent. I really think we should go for the gusto and get the house that we want and go all in. And I said, okay, let's do it. Now, after talking to our brokers, it was a husband and wife team. They really rest assured that you're going to gain the amount of equity in this house that you wouldn't in the other. And I think you're going to be really shocked at how much this house is worth in 5 to 10 years. They were absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I now know that holding myself back wouldn't have been a good financial decision for us in the long run. And we would have moved already.
That's crazy.
So when I sit and talk about emotional decisions that you have to make, I've been there. I knew we could afford it, but I got myself all worked up and just kind of wanted to back out and buy a house that was so much cheaper because that just made me feel more comfortable. And now I realize for our family and for our future, it made sense to buy exactly what we could afford. We did not overextend ourselves. We were approved for more, but we decided to stay within the amount of money that we were already paying.
Yeah, it's super important. I tell people this too, like, to be comfortable. I heard this from an interview I was watching a couple years ago, and the girl, she goes, hey, I tell my people to be comfortable in your house, you got to be comfortable in your payment. Mm-hmm. And that stuck with me. I was like, wow.
And I tell you after your lender tells you that, I tell you, I don't want you to settle for something because you're so excited. I want you to love your house. I want you to be really excited with your purchase.
Yeah, that's a thing. Mm-hmm. Well, I think, is that all we had?
I think we could kind of do some things kind of offbeat a little bit. So let's talk about when crafting an offer, there is something on the contract and the financing addendum called loan cost provisions, or a lot of people in the industry will call them seller concessions. So I'm starting to see quite a bit of those right now and using them in negotiations myself. So let's talk about that. For instance, if you're buying that $500,000 house, let's say it's a house that's been on the market a little while. They don't necessarily want to negotiate in price, but maybe you're going to ask them to cover your closing costs or a portion of your closing costs. Loan cost provisions or seller concessions, it's a negotiated price. It could be anything. It could be $3,000, $5,000, $10,000. I've seen $15,000. What it allows you to do is buy down your interest rate, and this is where you would use that money with your lender and determine how you want to do it. Are you covering closing costs with the escrow closer at the end? Are you buying down your rate? Are you trying to accomplish all of those things? There's a strategic way in order to have some of those things covered.
Right, and it also depends on the loan that you have. So let's talk about like conventional compared to FHA. So if you're putting 3% down on a conventional, your max seller credit is 3%. Where if you're putting 3.5% down on FHA, that max credit is 6% all day. So that's something we look at with our buyers, like, hey, based on this property, does it make sense to go conventional, get a 3, or can we ask for a full 6%? And now we're buying the rate down, covering closing costs. So it is important depending on the loan amount, and you'll know, what your max seller credit is, based on the loan amount or based on the loan program that we're using. So we do go into depth on that because that's part of the strategy.
We're talking about that long before the offer's crafted. And even as a listing broker, I have gone back, instead of absorbing $10,000, which now, even though we've agreed on $500,000, the seller's now getting $490,000. I've even went back and I'm trying to understand, do they not have closing costs? Are they trying to buy their rate down? I will call their lender, and say, how much money, $10,000 seems like quite a bit for closing costs and buying down the rate. I ask, what are we doing with these seller concessions? The lender will typically give you a good idea. We're going to buy down the rate and they need some help with closing costs. Here's one thing I would do as a listing broker. If I priced my home with the seller properly, then I would go back to them and say, listen, the seller's willing to give you $5,000 to help you buy your rate down, but why don't you come in at $505,000, ask for $10,000, we'll give you back $10,000, but now you're absorbing half of it. So there's always a way to negotiate, to compromise and meet in the middle. So even though my seller said they're getting 5, that's it, I'm not doing any more, but we need 10. Well, then pony up, finance 5 more. It's not going to change your payment.
Quantized and over then 30 years.
It'll go from, the seller's line to the buyer's line at closing. There's many different ways to look at those items, and we want you to understand both sides of the seller and the buyer to make sure that, whether either side that you're on, you can have a good idea that everything is negotiable in real estate.
And that's how you, by knowing these things, can be an educated and confident buyer. By knowing these things, and we go in depth on, on our discussions with all of these to prepare you for it.
Let's talk about what are some things that buyers do to sellers that upset the seller, and it can happen right away, and it just puts a bad taste in their mouth from that point on.
Offer a low, like come in low ball, and sometimes you're going to insult the seller, and the seller won't even look at your offer.
Your broker should be saying, that's too low. I don't feel comfortable with that. Now, at some point, it's up to you, and we want to do it anyway. Well, we're going to do it. We need to follow through, but guiding you on, what's appropriate and what's not. The other thing is I've seen sellers accept a low offer, or I've seen sellers accept high seller concessions. And then what they'll say is, okay, before we agree on this, you can do a home inspection, but we are not offering a credit or one repair. Well, I will still see the buyer come forward, and they can still ask for a credit or repairs. And sometimes those things need to be ironed out. If you're just going to keep asking for more and more and more and not show any compromise, you're not going to get what you want from a seller or a buyer if you're both really rigid on your decisions. It's really strange to be in a compromising transaction with somebody that you will never meet.
Yeah. And there's also so let's say we don't get seller concessions up front with the offer right now, but that inspection comes back and there's some things that need to be fixed. And sometimes sellers are like, yeah, I don't want to get that. I don't want to fix that. Can we just give you a credit? So there is another spot where you can ask for that. And that's, something that we look at too, is in that time. Well, let's just wait for the inspection and see if we can leverage something.
I've had a buyer receive a 70-page home inspection on a 50-year-old home and tell me they wanted to address every single line item. And
I remember.
And I said, well, I'll tell you exactly what will happen. They will reject it and they will terminate the contract. And a conversation that I had with them to, let's look at what some of the major line items are, and let's see what's maybe feasible to a seller. I try to put it back on them. How would you feel if they gave you a 70-page report and said, clean up all this, when in fact they're being relocated, they don't live here anymore, they've already vacated the home, they want to sell it. That was something I brought up to the listing broker of, this is what they'd like to do. He said, we would terminate in 2 seconds. So it's always good to listen to your broker, because they're going to have a better sense of what the listing broker and seller are doing. That's why we talked about the seller's needs. If I know that person is relocated, they're already out of the house, they're not going to do a 70-page home inspection and meet every line item. I mean, I think what's typical is at best maybe 10 to 15. I've seen even somewhere around 6, or just bring up a point and ask for a credit. Your broker should have a good idea of what that listing broker has told them, of what the seller may or may not do.
Yeah. And the other thing too is, so sometimes we have a buyer, that wants to lowball, and we've showed them, hey, it'd be better to go in ask for that in a credit, whatever the situation is. But there are buyers that are hell bent on, no, I want to come in like lowball this. And sometimes we got to let them just do it. And
if you lowball at $20,000 and a seller says, okay, $20,000 isn't a lot depending on the price of the house. But if you keep asking, for a credit on your inspection or a bunch of repairs that is going to cost them more money. If there's an appraisal gap and you want them to bridge the gap, more than likely they're not going to.
Yeah.
So it's always best to really try to meet the seller's needs in the beginning and then just build upon that transaction with complete respectful compromise.
Agreed.
There will be things that the seller will give, but there will be things that the buyer will need to give.
Yep. It's a fun song and dance.
It is.
Well, that's all we have for today. If you have questions, please reach out to us. We want to help you understand the processes, the things that can go wrong. Again, just the stuff that we talked about here doesn't get talked about regularly, on the daily.
You typically have to go through the process to see what twists and turns you are going to go through.
Right. And so my information, Misty's information is going to be down in the description. But please give us a like, subscribe. If you found this valuable, share it with your friends. But please reach out to us via the phone number and the information that's there for you to reach out, emails.
Let's start the conversation about what your goals are, whether they're this year or even 3 years from now. Let's start that conversation and give you some guidance to better prepare and have the mindset to become a first-time home buyer.
Yep. And it goes a long way. So that's a wrap. So that's episode 2, Strikepoint Strategies. Thanks for listening, watching. And again, please like and subscribe and share this with your friends. We hope you found this valuable. And we're here to answer questions. So please reach out. Even if you don't live in Washington State, we want to hear from you. And thanks for listening. Have a great day.
Thank you.